When an urgent crisis met deep-seated prejudice, no one could have anticipated the chain of events that would follow. It was just past midnight when Dr. Nathaniel Carter's phone buzzed, startling him out of a rare and restless sleep. Squinting at the illuminated screen, he instantly felt his stomach drop. Calls at this hour seldom brought good news. The hospital's name glared back at him. He picked up on the second ring. "Dr. Carter speaking," he said, his voice rough with sleep as he sat up, already on edge. "Doctor, this is Lucy from the ER." The voice came in hurriedly. "We got a critical case, a teenage girl involved in a bad accident on Route 9. It's serious. We need you here immediately." His pulse quickened. Nathaniel was one of the few surgeons in Kingston County qualified to handle complex trauma surgeries. If they were calling him, the situation was dire. "I'll be there in 15 minutes, he replied, already swinging his legs out of bed. Tossing on a pair of jeans and a jacket over his scrubs, he grabbed his car keys and bolted out the door. As he drove through the quiet streets, his mind raced. Route 9. How often had he petitioned the city council to install proper streetlights and warning signs on that treacherous stretch of road? The sharp curves and blind spots were a recipe for disaster, especially for inexperienced drivers. Tonight, those ignored warnings felt painfully personal. The girl in question, he learned during a hospital update over Bluetooth, was Mia Keller, the daughter of Deputy Chief Patrick Keller. Nathaniel had crossed paths with Keller a handful of times at local charity events. The man was polite but distant, always steering clear of anything that scratched the surface of uncomfortable truths about race or privilege. But none of that mattered now. This was about saving a life. Nathaniel gripped the wheel as he pushed his car to its limits, cutting through the stillness of the night. He had no room for delay, until the flashing blue and red lights in his rearview mirror stopped him cold. "Are you serious?" he muttered, easing off the accelerator and pulling to the side of the road. His heart pounded, not just with urgency, but with the bitter knowledge of how these encounters could unfold. Rolling down his window, he squinted into the beam of a flashlight as an officer approached. "License and registration," barked the officer, his tone brusque. "I'm Dr. Carter," Nathaniel began, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm a surgeon at Kingston General, responding to a critical emergency. A teenage girl's life is at stake, and I don't have time to waste." He gestured toward his hospital badge hanging from his jacket pocket. The officer frowned, inspecting him and the car with suspicion. "Speeding like that? You're putting more lives in danger," he said coldly. Another officer stood a few steps back, his hand resting on his holstered weapon. "Look," Nathaniel said, keeping his tone firm but measured, "call Kingston General. They'll confirm. I'm on my way to operate on the deputy chief's daughter, Mia Keller. Please, this is a matter of life and death." Instead of acting with urgency, the officers took their time. The first cop radioed in, verifying Nathaniel's credentials as precious minutes ticked by. Nathaniel's fingers drummed on the steering wheel as he fought to stay composed, though frustration threatened to boil over. "I'm begging you," he finally said, his voice strained. "Every second counts. If it were your family, you'd understand." The officer eventually handed back his documents. "Slow down next time," he muttered without a hint of apology. Nathaniel didn't wait for another word. Tires screeching, he shot back onto the road, every passing second feeling heavier than the last. He couldn't shake the bitter taste of the encounter, but he had to set it aside. A life was in his hands. By the time he pulled into the hospital parking lot, his pulse was racing. He jogged through the automatic doors where Lucy met him at the entrance. "She's hanging on by a thread," she said urgently, leading him toward the operating room. "Major internal bleeding and a suspected artery rupture. She's already in pre-op." "What's her blood pressure?" Nathaniel asked, his mind switching gears. 55/30, Lucy replied grimly. "We've got her on fluids, but we're running out of time." Nathaniel nodded sharply as he scrubbed in, his focus narrowing to the task at hand. "Let's get started." The operating room was a controlled storm of movement, and Nathaniel took his place at the center. Every decision, every second mattered. As he worked, he forced himself to push everything else aside, the anger, the delay, the weight of systemic hurdles. For now, there was only the fight to save Mia's life. The young patient lay unconscious on the operating table, her frail body connected to a web of machines. Dr. Nathaniel Carter glanced at the observation window above, catching sight of Deputy Chief Patrick Keller, his hands pressed against the glass, his face a mixture of fear and helplessness. Nathaniel refocused on the task at hand. Guiding his team, he worked swiftly to stop the bleeding. The room buzzed with the hum of monitors and the steady rhythm of his instructions. As his hands moved with precision, the earlier delay crept into his thoughts. Could those minutes have worsened her condition? He forced the doubt aside. The priority now was saving her. After what felt like an eternity, the surgery was complete. Nathaniel stepped out of the operating room, his bloodied scrubs clinging to him. Keller was pacing the corridor, freezing when their eyes met. "She's stable," Nathaniel said, his voice tired. "We stopped the bleeding in time. She's in recovery." Relief washed over Keller. "Thank you," he said, his voice breaking. "You saved my little girl." Nathaniel hesitated, then spoke, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I almost didn't get here. Your officers stopped me. They wasted precious time questioning me instead of letting me save your daughter." Keller looked uncomfortable. "I'll look into it," he muttered. "That's not enough," Nathaniel replied sharply. "This isn't the first time something like this has happened to me, but tonight it almost cost someone their life. Your daughter's life. If that doesn't make you see the problem, I don't know what will." Keller looked away, his silence speaking volumes. After a long pause, he finally asked, "What happened?" "They stopped me for speeding. I told them I was heading to save a life. Your daughter's life, and they didn't care. 7 minutes were wasted. In an emergency, 7 minutes could mean life or death." Keller paled, visibly shaken. "I didn't know," he said quietly. "That's the problem," Nathaniel said firmly. "You didn't know because you didn't care to know. If it weren't your daughter, would you even care now? Would they?" Keller's shoulders sagged as the weight of the words settled. "I'll handle it," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Nathaniel shook his head. "You have to do more than handle it. You're in a position to change things. If you don't lead by example, this will happen again. And next time, the outcome might not be the same." Before Keller could respond, a nurse interrupted. "Deputy Chief Keller, your daughter's awake." Keller turned toward the recovery room, pausing to glance back at Nathaniel with a look that carried both gratitude and regret. Nathaniel didn't wait for further acknowledgement. He headed to the doctor's lounge, peeling off his scrubs as exhaustion set in. The night replayed in his mind. The officers, Keller's discomfort, the delay that could have been fatal. He had saved her, but the bitterness lingered. It wasn't over. Not yet. Nathaniel sat in the lounge, the exhaustion of the night weighing on him, but his mind wouldn't rest. He'd saved a life, yet the lingering sting of injustice overshadowed the relief. Change felt distant, buried beneath excuses and indifference. He thought of Keller's daughter, alive despite the barriers, and wondered if this would finally spark action, or if it would fade into the usual silence. Taking a deep breath, Nathaniel resolved that his voice wouldn't be another one lost in the noise. This wasn't just about him. It was about what could no longer be ignored. The fight wasn't over.